Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name's Dan Schultz. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Financial Affairs Committee. I want to call tonight's meeting to order. We'll begin with a roll call led by Ms. Harding. Never mind. I've been usurped. Okay. Starting with Dr. Whiting.
Ross Whiting, present.
Jennifer Lohman, present.
Pam Henry present.
Charles Burdell Williams, present.
Zachary Epps, present.
Leah Mulhern, present.
Robin Murphy, present.
And Dan Schultz, present. The next item on the agenda would be approval of the previous meeting's minutes.
Motion.
So moved by Mr. Burdell Williams. Is there a second? Dr. Whiting, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion passes. All right, Mr. Swigert, you have the rest.
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February 4th Finance Meeting. Tonight on the agenda, we are going to take a look at our interim financial statements through the month of January. We are going to spend most of the night talking about the preliminary budget. And finally, taking a look at some board action items, reviewing some board action items from the last board meeting. Next slide. Sorry, that's very difficult to see from here. All right, so looking at the balance sheet through January 31st, we are showing total assets of 98.7 million. We are showing a cash balance of 90 million versus 87 million last year at the same time. So cash moving in a positive direction. Also looking at total revenues on the bottom of the balance sheet, our total revenues through the month of January are 113 million, and our total expenditures are 69 million. Also through the end of January, so showing a total change in fund balance of 43.8 million through 7 months of operation. Next slide, please. Our local source revenues are primarily real estate tax driven, hence the increase in local source revenues. On the state side, we're starting to see some of the monies come in that were approved in the state budget, particularly the charter school reimbursement that was approved last year. And we're also starting to, we also have fully collected the homestead money that was increased last year. So 2 positive developments, 2 timely payments on the state side. And of course, we're grateful to receive that money to fund the school district operations. On the federal side, we are running the same pace as last year at this time, with no increase. With ESSER expired, no increases expected in federal revenue. On the expenditure side, we are showing a $7.7 million increase in expenditures year over year. The main driver of that is we have, as you recall, for those of you who work at the district, this is a 3 payroll month, which means we have an extra payroll through the end of January this year versus last year. And that accounts for roughly $3 million of that increase. So that's purely a timing issue that will resolve itself before the end of the school year. Again, we've been talking about this throughout the course of the year. A couple areas of note are our special ed programs. We are seeing an uptick in our special ed tuitions and placements. That is going to be a deeper conversation when we get to the final budget, and we truly flesh out the magnitude of that as we get closer to the end of the year. It's also worth pointing out that we have our CA settlement in here, the settlement of that contract through back in December. And the one final item is our facilities. We had some vacancies filled. We had some significant expenditures with the setup of Epic. And again, we incurred some additional expenditures with the refurbishing of Elkins Park School to get it up and running and to get the building restored after the steam leak. Next slide. Because of that extra payroll in January, you can see the expenditure curve kind of looks like it takes an uptick. But like I said, that should resolve itself before the end of the year. Next slide. One of the most positive takeaways of tonight is if you look at our local revenues, some of our largest categories, and in all categories, they are increasing. For those of you following the news, you see that the Fed has dropped its prime rate twice within the last year. That has led to a lower investment return on our bank accounts, which has resulted in a $200,000 decrease through the amount of interest income earned through January of 25 through January of 24. Last year, we collected a total of $3.7 million in interest income, a big part of our budget. We continue to monitor that and how it will impact us in the future. Any questions on the interim financial statements through January? Yes, Zachary.
Mr. Epps.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the overview. Just for clarity, the delinquent taxes raise is, I guess it fluctuates year to year. But I guess this year we're collecting more compared to last year. I guess that, how volatile should we expect that to be, I guess, year to year?
So the delinquent taxes are all the real estate taxes that aren't collected through January. They go in a receivable list that's collected at the county level. We actually use a third-party tax collector to pursue those taxes. So if you have a good economic year and everyone's able to pay their real estate taxes timely, that balance shrinks, and there's a delay in which you realize less money outstanding to be collected. And then when you have more volatile economic times, you collect more, and that kind of has a year or two delay in which you collect those taxes because it's outside of the current year tax collection cycle. So I would say there's typically a 1 or 2 year delay between when those taxes are collected in full or when they're delayed in collection. No other questions? I will move on to the next slide.
I'll just Mr. Kaufman, are there any questions online? Well, we have 4 questions. Okay, thank you.
I keep including this slide to drive it home. This is our calendar of our budget, our Act 1 and our budget timeline. We are currently right in the middle. We are presenting the 25-26 preliminary budget at our February board meeting. And I think this year it will be a good idea just to approve it well in advance of the end of the year. That way it's out of the way since it's fresh in our minds. Next slide. So starting off is a summary of the preliminary budget itself. Last year's final budget for the 24-25 school year had revenues of $134.3 million. The current preliminary budget has total revenues of $139 million, with $1.9 million of those revenues coming from our fund balance to plug a budget deficit. Keep in mind that this preliminary budget does not include any sort of tax increase, and it includes very conservative estimates on state budget allotments to Cheltenham School District. As the governor just announced his budget this morning, there has not really been enough time to digest what that budget means for the school district. On the expenditure side, the one area I wanted to highlight is our regular program expense. If you recall, last year, we entered the budget season and closed the final budget with some unsettled collective bargaining agreement contracts, so they were not included in our budgeted amounts. So for the 25-26 school year, we not only have to include increases that were awarded in 24-25, but also 25-26. So you have, in essence, 2 years of contractual increases impacting the budget. And that creates probably the largest swing in this budget this year would be the salaries. And that is the reason. Next slide, please. As stated on the revenue side, the final budget last year had a $134.3 million revenue. This year, the most significant changes are a decrease in the estimated interest income driven by the current market rate. And on the state side, we have several large monies impacting 25-26. One would be the Ready to Learn equity grant. That money was awarded as part of the 24-25 budget, but not available until 25-26. and that amounts to 1.1 million. The school board approved the resolution, I believe, in December, to utilize that money to offset future tax increases of the district, and this is where it is placed so that we do not need to increase taxes for that amount. Also, the charter school reimbursement amounted to $289,000 was included in this budget with the anticipation that it would continue in some shape or form going forward, and then everything else. But state net revenue increases are really the big driver of this year's budget on the revenue side. Again, with no real estate income tax proposed at this point. And that brings us to a total preliminary revenue of $139 million. Next slide, please. I believe I covered everything on this revenue note slide, except that the current budget shortfall, the 1.9 million projected, is roughly equivalent to 2% increase in real estate taxes. And just a reminder that our Act 1 index is 4.7%. Next slide. Always a good idea to highlight in graphic form where our revenue comes from. 67% of the district's revenue comes directly from our real estate tax collection process. 23% comes from state sources, state subsidies, and state reimbursements for PACERS and Social Security. 8% comes from other local sources like earned income tax and IDA money. And 1% comes from, roughly 1% comes from federal sources that flows through the general fund. Next slide, please. All right, the last slide on revenue. So I thought it would be a good idea just to take a quick look at where the district's revenue comes from in all of our major governmental funds. Our major governmental funds are our general fund, which we budget for every year and approve a budget. We also have a food service fund, and we also have a capital fund. The capital fund gets most of its funding through transfers from the general fund. If we have a good year, that excess is set aside for capital improvements. The food service fund gets most of its money from state and federal subsidies. And as you can see, the general fund, as we just discussed, gets most of its money from the real estate tax collection process. But I would highlight the food service revenue column or food service column. We collect roughly $700,000 in lunch sales. We collect $387,000 from state subsidies, and we get roughly 1.6, almost $1.7 million from federal subsidies and commodity donations. And on the capital side, the only money that's flowing into that account at this point in time is interest earnings, which for last year totaled roughly $438,000. So what I wanted to highlight on this slide was just for all of our major revenue sources, what is the total amount flowing into the district from all local revenue sources across the general, food service, and capital fund. The total flow incoming is 105 million. Our state source revenue flow is 31.5 million, and all of our federal source money coming to the district is roughly $3.7 million. And that federal money consists of title monies, IDA money flowing through from the MCIU, national school lunch subsidies, and medical access subsidies coming through the Department of Welfare. All right, any questions on district revenues?
Are there any questions from the board? Mr. Riddell Williams?
Thanks. Just thinking about what was shared a moment ago, just about thinking about our revenue sources. I know that we have previously, under different economic circumstances, been investigating and even taken action on debt refinancing. And I'm just curious if the trend that we're seeing currently is potentially preparing us for a moment like that, and if the district can comment at all on if we're investigating those avenues.
So we're constantly in touch with our bond counsel. When a lot of our bonds were refinanced in 21 and 2022, I mean, we were really at historic rock bottom rates. So the financing window hasn't presented itself in any sort of meaningful way that would provide any sort of substantial substantial savings and probably won't for some time. So our focus has been in this prime rate environment to focus on how do we move our money to earn the most on it, and how do we structure and ladder our funds to earn the most money. So we partner with PISLAF primarily, and what they help us do is they help us structure our cash flow. We sit down with PISLAF annually and review our cash flow, and anything that isn't needed for cash flow goes into an investment, and that investment is set to a term to where it needs to expire to when it's needed. So in that way, we have money constantly being invested, taken off to pay bills like debt and payroll, and then put back in to maximize the amount of earnings we can get. So that's been my focus since I've been here, given the interest rate market. And you look at historical revenues, we had almost $3.7 million in interest income, which is money that falls out of the sky. So that's the offset to not being able to refinance.
Yeah, good. That was good. Thank you for that context. I think it's important that we continue to do that work, and I'm grateful for the way that we have continued to manage it in the economic environment that we've been in post pandemic. Just quick follow-up question. The acronym you used, PISLAF, I think. Can you what is that?
Pennsylvania School District Liquid Asset Fund. I think that's what it stands for. So a lot of school districts do just what I described, and through the same program. And their fund is commonly used, them and PLGIT. I don't know what PLGIT stands for, Pennsylvania Local Investment Government Trust or something. So they're fully collateralized, meaning all the money that's put in there has a backing. So there's the risk is extraordinarily low in those funds. The one silver lining about the volatility we're seeing in the markets and in the world today is that has made the Fed scared to decrease rates. I mean, we were anticipating a lower prime rate as the economy started to improve, but now they kind of pull back on that and have been scared. So we're seeing, we anticipated a drop off from 3.7 to 1 to 0 within the next couple of years. We're not quite seeing that steep of a drop off. So if there is a silver lining out there, that is one.
Thank you.
Ms. Lohman.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Thank you so much, Mr. Swigert, for this presentation. The revenue pie chart actually happens to be my favorite slide from finance always, because I think it just dramatically shows kind of what we're up against in terms of where our revenue comes from, which is the fact that we are still dramatically dependent on local revenue sources. The state is increasing. That's nice to see. I remember sitting here a couple of years ago and the state slice was at like 19%, I think. So hoping that kind of continues to go up, but I just think it's important for people to know that this is our reality, that we really are very dependent on local revenue sources, and why it's so important for us to continue to advocate, especially currently now at the state level, given the situation at the federal level, for increased financial support from the state. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I think our current increased local share of state revenue has been thanks to to good local leadership at the state level, for sure.
Mr. Epps.
The continuing the theme on revenue sources, the Ready to Learn block grant. And obviously the governor's budget address today talked a lot about the adequacy funds. I heard less about the tax equity funds. But I know there were some figures from last year, and I know there's still, how do you apply for things like that? But I see there's a figure here for the Ready to Learn block grant. That's where those numbers will be. So does this number represent any of the tax equity money that we might be able to apply for, or?
So anything from today's governor's address is not included in this presentation. The money that was approved last year is available to us this year. So that $1.1 million is available to us in the 25-26 school year.
So that's what I'm saying. So it is represented there.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Oh, so then I guess should it be higher? I thought we got more Ready to Learn
So we get about $380,000 and then,
So, it's not.
and then on top of this, we got
Okay,
one
got it,
point
got
one.
it. I thought we got more. Okay, thank you, thank you.
Any other board questions or comments? I had one quick question around, I know this is a very rough draft, it's the preliminary proposed budget. We just had a presentation earlier today that was talking about potential shifts around EP and potential need for additional administrative costs. And rather than assume, I'm going to ask, are any of those considerations reflected in this budget at this point, or is this not including those?
So trying to create an accurate snapshot, everything is budgeted at current employment levels.
Thank you very much. That makes sense. Since there was a lot covered, just are there any questions from the public at this point? Okay, thank you.
All right, looking at our change in budget expenditures, as I hinted at earlier, last year we had a final budget of 134.3 million. The current year increases are primarily due to our budgeted increase in salaries and benefits. The benefits primarily being our PSERS contribution. As you recall, the PSERS rate stayed the same. It's 34% of every dollar in wage that we pay. That's still a high rate, so that 1 million is approximately that or primarily that PSERS rate paid on those additional wages. And like I said, the additional wages are in essence 2 years of increases for one of our collective bargaining agreements because that contract wasn't settled by the time the last budget was passed. There is also an allotment and allowance in there for one unsettled contract entering into next year, that being our Act 93 personnel, as that's not a traditional collective bargaining agreement. I felt comfortable including some sort of allotment for that contract as well, as it more than likely wouldn't be in status quo. And with all that in mind, that keeps our total expenditure budget of just a hair over $139 million. All right, looking at our next slide, it's as Jenny alluded to, this slide is also important because it shows that 68% of what we do is salaries and benefits. We are primarily in the business of staffing, and that's where the vast majority of our money is allocated. All right, next slide. I believe we covered all of these. I did not cover health insurance. Our current first look rate is 1%, which is fantastic. We have the lowest increase in CPAS with the exception of maybe Eastern, who I think had a decrease in membership, which is why they saw a decrease. So that's something to celebrate, something we've been working on for the past couple of years. And, given our historical 10% increase, that's roughly a $700,000 difference annually. So quite a big number. Our transportation contract currently calls for 4% increases annually, and we're in the middle of that, right in the middle of that contract with an early renewal clause next year, something we can revisit at that time. But 4% is pretty typical for what's out there in school districts, probably a tad low. And again, our substitute costs increase annually, and we continue to adjust for those substitute costs as staffing percentage and staffing ratios continue to improve as our employment base continues to be filled now that we leave COVID. All right, any questions on the budgeted expenditures?
Mr. Bertel Williams?
I'm hoping this is the right place to ask this question. I'm sure I could ask it just in the budget, but thinking about the presentation that we just received at the Facilities Committee related to our stadium project, and board initially authorized I think a $10 million price tag for that project, and what we saw was I think 12 and change is the projection. Is that shown here, or and if not, what is the expected impact here?
So probably a good idea would be next month at the facilities meeting to review those original feasibility estimates and where we are now. Those costs are based on 2023 prices, and we have escalations as the years progress. Some of our projects we're currently in the works are actually coming in less than what we budgeted. So let's take a look at what those estimates were, where we're at now. and let's take a deeper dive on how we're going to fund them. Currently, we had some excess reserve set aside for the stadium project, so there was an anticipated bond issue for that project this summer. But as we move into next year and we move into Cedar Brook and Glenside, which are much bigger projects, we're going to have to start talking bond issue and debt service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burdell Williams. Just as a clarification, Mr. Burdell Williams said the board had approved $10 million. Procedurally, we received the recommendation, which had an estimate of 10 million. We have only currently approved the aluminum bleacher cost in terms of actual approval, correct?
That's correct. A $1 million aluminum bleachers and a $38,000 electric transformer were approved. There was a total budgeted feasibility study estimate of I believe $73 million at the onset of all this work.
Understood. Yes, I just wanted to clarify that there will be future votes for the approval of the bids that we received yesterday. Those have technically not been approved yet and will be over time with public comment to boot. So thank
Yeah,
you.
we have some pluses and minuses. I think we have an HVAC project that's going to come in well under what was expected from that original budget. I believe Glenside right now might come in slightly lower and Cedar Brook slightly higher. So we have some movement as, you know, we unpack these projects and find things that maybe weren't anticipated upon the estimate that was provided.
Thank you. Are there any other board comments or questions? No, I'm seeing Mr. Coffin say none from the public. Thank you.
All right, next slide. All right, so I wanted to include the IFO, the Independent Fiscal Office's projection of the Act 1 index and what it looks like going forward. On the very bottom of this slide, you'll see the Act 1 index, the base and the weighted average. Because of where our district's market value personal income ratio per student landed, we qualified for the weighted average Act 1 index, which came in at 4.7%. And you can see we have a forecasted Act 1 index going into future years. Well, I pulled this right off the IFO. I think their columns might be wrong. Going into 5% and then 4% in future years. So when we look ahead and where our budget has to be, we have to stay within obviously those realms and hopefully significantly below it. Next slide. I don't know how well you can see this slide. After following up with our ability to tax in the future, our Act 1 index, I thought it would be worth presenting a projection. So what I put together was a spreadsheet for digestion. I won't unpack this whole thing at this meeting because we'll be here for another 3 hours. But in essence, what this spreadsheet is, it's showing the district's historical spend in the general fund, historical revenues, historical expenditures going back to the 2020 fiscal year and through this current year through June 30th, 2024, which we're almost at the end of closing that audit. So we'll have that presentation for you next month. But anyway, showing all this historical data and then projecting that data out into the future. What does this fiscal year end look like, 26, 27, 28, and trying to anticipate some of the changes and some of the obstacles that might come up in future years. So across the top, I put what are just a rough estimate for what a real estate tax increase might look like to give us a baseline to move forward. And I have 1.75% per year. I projected out salaries, giving some industry averages, projected out PSERS, given rates that were projected future rates, which may come in lower than where they're at. If all things stay the same, those are the projected expenditures going out through the 2028 school year. And kind of showing the trend of what is the percentage our expenditures are increasing per year and what do we have to be prepared to address. Obviously, there are curveballs in there. What is the state going to provide to the district? What is the federal government going to provide to the district? Historically, the federal government doesn't provide very much. In the recent history, the state has provided more. So some uncertain questions out there. So one of the things I wanted to highlight was in our local source revenue. Our revenue struggles to increase in future years because of the anticipated decrease in our interest income. Anticipating a $3.7 million source of income to, close to zero by 2028. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. but that's the conservative estimate for this projection. Also pointing out on the bottom of the slide, a line for debt service, and that's debt service for future projects and funding. Looking at a 2026 project timeline, that's when you would start to have to consider issuing debt service and then potentially paying it back beginning this for the fiscal year end June 30th, 2027, with a phase up until our debt service reaches nearly $13 million, which 13 million is well within the range of school districts in the Delaware Valley. But that's an extra little over $1 million we have to budget for as a result of these capital improvements. I know this is a lot of information. Feel free to email me with any questions or feel free to reach out if there's anything you see on the spreadsheet that you'd like to discuss further. Any questions at the moment?
Any questions from the board? Mr. X?
First, I've got to say thank you. Is Principal Taylor still in the room? No. So I'll say thank you in his honor. When you have more to say, you can still say thank you. But this time I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to say thank you this time. The projection. Before I joined the board, even before I joined the board, I said, "Hey, is it possible we can look at some projections in the years to come?" And it might be a better time because we passed the negotiations, things like that. But being able to look ahead is so useful for us in terms of the decisions we make today and how it impacts into what we're talking about. Because if we look ahead, even if we increase taxes at 1.75 and so forth, we're still looking at a deficit in the not too distant future, which will increase a compounding deficit from year to year is what we're looking at projection. So to folks' comments about advocacy, to folks' comments about our local effort, we can't simply just keep raising taxes. And so we're certainly going to have our partners, if it's not through the adequacy fund, maybe not today, but just something, really a call to us that this is something we have to pull together. Ginny, Ross, we're on the advocacy task force. So really just one, thanks, because with these numbers, we can draw a sense of urgency for ourselves for what to do and be proactive about what to do.
Thank you, Mr. Epps. Any other board comments? I do want to reiterate the thanks for this very rich slide, and this context is helpful both for the community as they're participating in big discussions around facilities, but also very importantly for our board to be making decisions with eyes wide open. So thank you.
Yeah, I think if there's one takeaway, if we continue to have nominal increases from the state, they aren't going to be enough to offset what is the current trend in the workplace, and that's right now is a 3% increase in wages across the state, as evidenced by the Act 1 index. So that 3% growth in expenditures isn't offset by a 1% increase in state and 1.7 increase in local revenues. So unless we do one of two things, we increase real estate taxes, which isn't our best option here in Cheltenham, or we look at trying to find ways to reduce expenditures or streamline operations. That's also another option for the district.
I'm seeing there are no public comments on mic.
All right, next slide. So I didn't fully digest the governor's budget today. And I know this is difficult to read, but this spreadsheet is what was released by Governor Shapiro and is the summary of his budget proposal, a high-level summary. The one item I will point out, which is a little concerning, is a basic ed subsidy request of 0.9% year over year. I believe last year it was a 13% increase, and I believe last year there was almost double the increase in money for the Department of Education as what there is this year. So certainly much less of an ask, much less of a request this year. One item I'll point out that I still think the district needs to digest is there's a lot of money in the Ready to Learn block grant line item that the district benefited from last year. And what does that mean? As we unpack this budget, there'll be more to come, hopefully by the next meeting. Any question on the governor's proposed budget?
Any board questions? Ms. Lovin?
Did the governor propose a a formula for sort of, are they using the same formula for assigning the basic ed funding, or did they change, is it gonna change at all?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I know that he mentioned in his speech the inadequate funding in Pennsylvania and that needed to be addressed. But I didn't quite get to digest everything he said today.
Thank you.
Not in a definitive manner, but they're celebrating the formula. And so they're, yeah, and so it's being framed now as let's continue with that formula. So to your question, I think it's somewhere around $500 million to go through that formula for basic education.
Yeah, and what's important to notice about the formula changes is no district loses. Just some districts get more than others going forward.
Just to clarify, when you say the formula being celebrated, that's the newer formula, correct?
The adequacy formula, which
Thank
is intended to fill the gap and ensure, to Mr. Swiger's point, to ensure that districts that need more funds get them, and districts that, you know, according to the formula, may not need as much increases. No, so that, yeah, they didn't get, to his point, no district will lose. That's the hold harmless, that you won't go below what you received the previous year by way of law. So to the point, the formula's there, they're celebrating it, they want to use it, but there's still a gray area because of hold harmless and others.
Correct. If you're in a healthy district that has a growing tax base that's expanding, and you have additional real estate tax revenue coming in, and you have a student population that's not in need, you probably are looking at mostly a flat piece of that formula. If you're in a district with a lot of students in need, in low-income households, don't speak English, things of that nature, at large charter school enrollment, you receive more based on the formula. Yep.
I have a wonky question related to our exposure from a federal funding perspective through the state. I'm curious, do you have a sense of what portion of the state's funding that we receive is actually funded through federal grants?
I do not.
That's fair. It's just on my mind, and maybe it's a question for the legislative group here, Mr. Epps. Just, I know our literal exposure here is 1%, which is not very large, though we are thankful for it. But that would be helpful to understand as well. Thank you.
I'm suspicious that it's only the medical access money, which is $250,000, because most of the federal money we get has a reporting requirement. We get audited annually. It's called a single audit, where they take a look specifically at the federal dollars we spend and how they're spent and what we spent them on. That's a whole separate audit schedule. We can talk about that when we review the audit, but I don't want everyone to get up and leave. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no other questions, next slide. Talking about board action items for next week, this is just a review. We talked about this at the facilities meeting. That's the change order for the Cheltenham High School roof. Next slide. KCBA shared the bid opening for the turf and track. That also is set for approval at next week's board meeting. Next slide. Reviewing the MCIU services budget. The district's increase is 4%, or roughly $2,000. So a very nominal increase in the services budget. Again, that's government relations support, professional learning, technology services, shared services throughout the county that Cheltenham benefits from. The actual student services budget will be approved later, and is, I believe, was roughly 1.5 million last year. So that's coming towards the final budget, but this is a small piece that needs to be approved this month. And next slide. And that is it, if there are no other questions.
Are there any other questions? Yeah? No? No? I do just want to make a comment regarding the roof, just to put it on record and for clarity. the way it was framed in the facilities meeting was there is a grant, and in order to maximize the grant, we want to approve an additional section. But I want to make it clear that that additional section is also in need of repair. It is a good investment. There are a lot of parts of that roof that do need work, some more urgently than others. And so this is a both penny wise, but also effective
That-
use.
That's
of-
correct. The entire roof is not going to make it through the end of the building's useful life unless all of it is touched at some point.
Right.
So the area above Stratton Hall needs to be touched immediately. And that will be done this summer. And the rest of it at some point does as well. So the reason that section was chosen is because of the contractors mobilizing and setting up safety and security and providing the materials on site. It's significantly cheaper for them to just knock out that section that's right next door instead of trying to do another section on another side of the building. Plus it keeps their project contained and they're not spread all over the site. So we did bid that project on a per unit basis. So it's a pre-bid amount. It's not as if they pulled a number out of the sky.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you.